sector, trying to understand what's actually been happening during the COVID period. And I did go to some talks. I remember going to an online talk from Hull actually over the teaching learning conference, and I think your results during COVID were rather positive for BME awarding gaps, that actually during COVID they'd increased. So I'm going to be telling a slightly different story for us. And also, it's in my own crude way of trying to work out whether there is an awarding gap, what makes up this awarding gap. So I've tried my little bit to work out how much commuting pays within that. So we set out to gain a greater understanding of our students, which we've heard a lot about today, that importance of understanding students, to determine the direct impact of commuting. So commuting was taking place before COVID, but I think as I highlighted before, one of the questions was that yes, we are returning now to on-campus teaching, and certainly the strategy at Kingston University is that much of what we do will return. There was talk that some of it would be hybrid, but I think there is a realisation to bring it back. That may be some external pressures as well, and overall to develop and implement our inclusive strategies. So an introduction, as we know, the reasons for the observed national awarding gaps are complex. I'm not going to try and explain them all here, I'll just put my own little spin on it. BME students are more substantially likely to go to universities nowadays than their white peers. But Kingston University, where I operate, is in London. And what we do find in London is that there's actually higher attainment in secondary education now from pupils from ethnic disadvantaged backgrounds. However, when you look at London as a whole, some of the largest awarding gaps are found in London, which actually is a bit of a paradox from that point of view. So there are a high percent, but for Kingston University, we do have a high percentage of those students who are coming directly from those institutions within London, which they're doing better at. And what we do find is that a lot of those students remain in the home environment. So actually a lot of the environment around them where they've done well in secondary schools at London is still around them. However, one thing that we do know changes is that a lot of those students from those ethnic unrepresented groups do choose to live at home, and that does create issues for them, particularly when it comes to commuting. And I'll show some data that we managed to get from our School of Life Sciences, Pharmacy, Chemistry on that. You may have all heard these kind of things that actually may come as a shock, because a lot of those students before, when they went to school, college, it was fairly local. Now they're being hit by a whopping big commute. Maybe 1.5 hours, it's causing stress, it's causing tiredness that they didn't appreciate before, and there's a whole catalogue that we probably read and seen before of those commentaries. Now, from our own studies, we actually did, and we had 550 students within our School of Life Sciences, Pharmacy, Chemistry, quizzed them and did a big survey to find out, well, how long was their commute? How long was their travel time? And what we did find is that actually our white student population only makes up about 34% of our cohort, and our BME makes up about 65%. But on some courses, I know Biomed, where I operate, and Nick's sitting over there, his course, we've got about 85% of our students from ethnically diverse backgrounds. When we look at it, in fact, white students are very focalised around the university. Most of those, on average, got a journey time about 33 minutes, living on average less than 4 miles from the university, while our BME students are living up to sort of almost 8 miles away. Their journey is almost double the time. So we're wondering, how does that impact, and how does that contribute to the awarding gap that we see? This is just a little plot here using a histogram just to show that actually where the white students are very focalized, but it's almost like we see a bimodal position. So you get some students, BME students, moving close to the university, while you get a lot still remaining outside of the university. These patterns are seen here. So a comparison of travel times undertaken by gender and ethnicity, breaking that data from that last one I showed you. Got BME on the left there, white students here on your right here. And you can see drastically different changes. We've got gender on there as well. There's no real difference between gender, whether you're a BME or white in there as well. But BME students there only about 46, 39% there are actually living within 30 minutes of the university, while the white students benefit about, almost 75, 80% of our students, white students, are living very close within 30 minutes of the university, and that can create very great differentials in their learning experiences. We looked at that between the first year, level 4, 5 and 6. What this is really showing is there's no real change. It's not as though a student who was making a long commute in the first year suddenly decides, I'm fed up with this, I now want to make sure in my final year I'm going to live close to the university. That doesn't happen. It would appear that once a student commits to commuting, that pattern is set all the way through. So again, here from level 4, 5, 6 white students, you've got 75, 80% of those students living very close to the university, having access to a lot more facilities, perhaps the library and different things like that being very close. Again, that impacts how students travel to the university. White students benefit from being able to walk, catch our into campus bus, and they cycle. While actually a lot of BME students living further away rely heavily on transport. And in fact, when we did this survey, a third of our students were relying on the train. So that's thinking about rail strikes now. We had rail strikes and we were still operating last week. Think about a third of our students would have been tied up. So it can be thinking, what lessons can we learn from COVID when there are such things as rail strikes? And also when we looked at questions like, how does the timetable work for me, which is one of the questions on the NSS, the most dissatisfied students are actually those who use the train. So it can be, there can be very sort of a lot of nuances within the NSS data that you may not necessarily appreciate. So what was the impact on assessment? So my thinking was, well, if you've got so many BME students commuting, maybe that represents a fair percentage of what the awarding gap is. And then came along COVID, which we had a sort of uncontrolled experiment here to say, well, what happened then? Well, everyone stopped commuting, and in fact, we even practicals and everything like learning site. I'm sitting here, Emily sitting there. We lose a lot of facilities there, taking practicals online as well. But what would be the impact if it stopped? It's not necessarily an ideal situation, but everyone was stuck at home then. Whether you were white students or BME students, you were suddenly stuck at home. So what was the difference made then? Well, this shows the faculty results. We've got faculty science, engineering, computing, nearly 4,000 students. The top line shows the BME gap from 2008 to 2001. 2001 is the year that we were 100% online, no commuting. 2002 is the year which just finished off with the exams online. So we did have a BME gap which we were closing from 2018 in the faculty to 2022, and there's also a faculty commuting gap there, which you can see that if a student commuted or not, there was about 4% differential. Maybe expectedly that gap closed because you only went down to 2% because no one's commuting. So the difference between commuting student one, but you can see there the tail goes up. Our BME gap rose. Looking more specifically within a sub-cohort of that 800 students, which are particularly bioscience students, in this case it's slightly different. It was actually commuting gap was larger than the BME gap there, and it was pretty constant. We'd actually brought it down quite to about 4% from a larger figure over a number of years, and it's almost stabilized out. But again, you see a tail down for the commuting students, as again, no one's commuting, but the BME students, the BME awarding gap has gone up. When we break that down again for the faculty, the purple line right at the top and the blue line, the purple line shows you white students who are non-commuting, and they traditionally do better. The line below in blue shows you white students again, but they're the ones who have to commute. But the two lines, the green lines, the top one shows you BME students who are commuting, and the lowest one, the lowest performing students, are BME students who are having to commute. So there is a differential there. So that was in the faculty. Breaking it down to life science is slightly different because our white students who are commuting seem to fare less. One of the things I want to draw your attention to in 2001, if you look closely at the intersections, the intersection of the two blue-purple lines come together, and the intersection for the green ones come together. And we also see that in the faculty here. It's almost as though for white students who previously commuted, their performance is almost aligned with their counterparts who were non-commuting. However, our students who were commuting, our BME students who were not commuting, they're the ones who seem to have suffered most. For some reason, they've suffered. Breaking that down, and I've got 2.8 times black means that for black students, there's 2.8, almost 3 times black of each black student will be commuting. This causes a sort of differential though, because you've got the top line there, the top red line shows you the non-commuting black students, the bottom blue line shows you the commuting students, and the green line shows you the average. So you can immediately see that the average, which will be our overall BME awarding gap, is drawn down immediately because we have a higher proportion of black students who are commuting. So it's drawing the line down. You also see that with the Asian students again. The green line is drawn down because we've almost got 3 times as many students commuting there who are Asian. Again, the same happened with mixed race, but the white students, less white students are commuting. And in fact, their green line is drawn upwards because our BME awarding gap is actually drawn up a little bit more because we have less students who are commuting who are white. Looking at this a little bit here, 2008, 2009, and 2018 columns, what I tried to do there is actually look at those premiums. So all students pay a premium. So for black students in 2008, if they were a student who was black student commuting was actually paying a premium deficit of 2.8% in their average marks. 2009, 1.8%, 2020, 3.5%. But then on the bottom, you've got the premium for white students. So in 2008, there was a differential between commuting, non-commuting white students, 2.6, 1.2, 2.9. So in fact, the difference between the two commuting, non-commuting groups isn't actually that great. And when we tried to do some calculations, we actually found out, and what I've highlighted there in the green is actually the difference between a black student and a white student commuting is actually only about 4.4%, but actually the awarding gap is 8.2%. So actually the impact on commuting is not that great overall in the scheme. So looking at overall, we do have 70% of our students are BME students, but 2/3 of them commute. For the white students, 30% of our students are white, but only around half of those commute. When we looked at it holistically, when I found out that commuting contributes to nearly 10% of our overall awarding gap. But this awarding gap is really a trait of commuting, because whether you're a white student or black student, you're paying roughly the same premium for commuting. So this here, trait of commuting, which I've worked out is about 10%, is really not a differential between the two student groups as such. It's just the premium you pay just because we happen to have more BME students who commute. So thinking about today in decolonisation, that actually leaves a not whopping part of the awarding gap totally unexplained. So I thought maybe you could explain a bigger part through commuting, but commuting hasn't really explained any of it. It gives us 10%, but it only gives us 10% by virtue of having more students in that category. I also looked a little bit further, because we normally look at it trying to increase the intersectionality. So we looked at one-way intersectionality, two-way and three-way here. So this is here looking at the impact of what commuting students would have had. So the first one shows you ethnicity, commuting, and gender. And what we're trying to do here is compare what happened in 2001, where commuting stopped, with the previous three years. we've included the middle table there, shows you when it's linked to index mean deprivation, and this one here links it to age. Where I've highlighted in green, there's very distinct distinct increases where students have done better. And if you look at those right at the bottom, we actually see that white students who are either, it doesn't matter which quintile they're in for index and mean deprivation, or white young students, or whether they're mature, it doesn't matter. They've benefited during the lockdown. They have benefited, those ones in green. But when we compare it against those students who were non-commuting before, we see an awful lot more red, particularly around black female students, black male students that come up in every single row. There's actually our black male and female students who really did suffer. It's almost like in the intersectionality, some universities, when I've gone to their presentations, said, well, their BME gap closed. Well, our BME gap has increased. Even though we took commuting out of the equation, it's increased. And one reason seems to be that the particularly black students, seem to pay quite a heavy price. These are the ones who would have been living within that 30-minute radius close to university. When everything locked down, they have really suffered during that time. So in conclusion, there are distinct differences in the commuting habits of BME and white students. Commuting contributes, however, to a universal premium irrelevant of the ethnicity of those students. Our commuting awarding gaps did narrow during the pandemic. However, at the same time, our BME awarding gaps increased. The COVID pandemic, from those results, has benefited some students, so it actually benefited our white students. But however, conversely, it really had a significant impact on our black students. And this is also quite important, thinking about the return now to campus, and it generates those arguments, a bit hybrid or not, because if you had it hybrid or kept everything online, which group of students are you going to benefit or not? It's a tricky question. So yeah, there does remain a need for better institutional handling students. I don't say that I have the answers. I would imagine that there are distinct challenges for different universities. Our university is unique because we have very high BME students where we are in London, compared to other universities with different populations of students. Irrespective of commuting or COVID, a substantial awarding gap still exists that I can't explain at all at the moment. Maybe we talk about decolonisation and are likely impacted by a host of factors. What I have tried to do when I work with our data insight people is done one way intersectionality, two way, and I've got it to three. But once you start getting higher and higher, you start thinking, how do I put all of these different factors together to get it together? So that's the big question. What's the other 90%? How do we resolve that other 90%? So thank you.